It's lovely to be able to share with my filling station friends. Sorry I can't be with you in person. This is the next best thing, and we give thanks to God for it. You can see sharing the stage with 2 leaping dolphins, an owl, and a Yorkshire Terrier on the filing cabinet. But I want to talk about a different sort of creature altogether. Numbers chapter 21. When the Canaanite, the king of Arad, who lived in the Negev, heard that Israel was coming by way of the Atharim, he fought against Israel and took some of them captive. Then Israel made a vow to the Lord and said, "If you will indeed give this people into our hands, then we will utterly destroy their towns." The Lord listened to the voice of Israel and handed over the Canaanites, and they utterly destroyed them and their towns. So the place was called Hormah, which means destruction. From Mount Hor, they set out by way to the Red Sea, to go around the land of Edom, but the people became impatient on the way. The people spoke against God and against Moses. Never a wise thing to do. "Why have you brought us up out of Egypt to die in the wilderness? For there's no food and no water, and we detest this miserable food." Then the Lord sent poisonous serpents among the people, and they bit the people, so that many Israelites died. The people came to Moses and said, "We have sinned by speaking against the Lord and against you. Pray to the Lord to take away the serpents from us." So Moses prayed for the people, and the Lord said to Moses, "Make a poisonous serpent and set it on a pole, and everyone who is bitten shall look at it and live." So Moses made a serpent of bronze and put it up on a pole, and whenever a serpent bit someone, that person would look at the serpent of bronze and live. And the serpent, that bronze serpent, appears again in a much more familiar passage in John chapter 3. We all know John chapter 3, don't we, for verse 16. But verse 11 begins, "Very truly, I tell you, we speak of what we know and testify to what we have seen, yet you don't receive our testimony." Jesus says, "If I've told you about earthly things and you don't believe, how can you believe if I tell you about heavenly things? No one has ascended into heaven except the one who descended from heaven, the Son of Man. And just as Moses lifted up the serpent in the wilderness, so must the Son of Man be lifted up, that whoever believes in him may have eternal life."
A few years back, because we have family in Australia and the Methodist Church decided to give me a sabbatical, I went to work at the Sydney Mission. And while we were in Sydney, I went to Tauranga Zoo. And there's a man in Tauranga Zoo greeting us, and he's got a snake draped around his neck. And he said to me, "Would you like to stroke my snake?" He was from Wales, New South Wales. He said, would you like to stroke the snake? And I said, "You are joking. Why would I want to stroke a snake?" So he basically said I was a bit of a pommy wuss. So I thought, well, the reputation of the country is now on my shoulders. So I went across praying for God to give me strength, and I stroked this snake. And he said, "Now, what did that feel like?" And I said, "It felt like an expensive pair of shoes I once had," which snakeskin shoes. Yeah, he didn't seem to appreciate it, I've got to say. But no, me and snakes, we don't get on well. So I thought I'd just share this about the bronze snake. And I read the other day about it who had to go to hospital on a stag night. He kissed a baby viper and he kissed him back and his tongue swelled out. I thought, why would anyone say I like snakes? Crazy stuff. But anyway, let's put this in context. Here's the children of Israel. They come to King Arad. He takes some of them prisoner, and they make a sort of pledge with the Lord. If you'll deliver him into our hands, we will totally destroy the Canaanites. And so God says, yeah, okay, does it, delivers them. So much does he deliver them that it says that the place was named Destruction. Now, if God did that in your seeing, you would think Wow, we really are being blessed, aren't we? But what happens next is quite staggering, because the next thing it says, as they travelled along, the people grew impatient. And when they grew impatient, they started to grumble. And very often when people start to grumble, it's about the food, isn't it? Motorway services, British rail buffets, things like that, church picnics. They start to grumble about food, and they're saying, we haven't got any bread, we haven't got any water, and the food we've got is miserable. And it doesn't stop there. They start to complain about God, and they start to complain about God's man, Moses. And basically they're saying, you just brought us out into the wilderness to die. Hold on a sec. Rewind a paragraph. I've just delivered the Canaanites into your hands, and now you're not satisfied because your stomachs are rumbling. And I just think, is there something in this for us? Yeah, I think there is. I think there is. I think that I meet so many people inside the church, sadly, who've got a very critical heart. They've got a very critical spirit. They seem to be complaining about anything, and nothing is good news to them. The old thing we used to say, they've got the joy of the Lord, but it's so deep, you need to get an oil rig to drill down to find. And that's in itself, you could say that's okay as far as it goes, but it isn't really, because if you start to grumble against God and express a dissatisfaction against God, and you say, oh, you brought me out here to die, there's going to be a consequence. And what I've seen, I've got to be careful about this. You've got to be careful if you tell people that they're a bit critical. You've got to be careful how you say it and who you say it to. Because I once made the observation, I reckoned I knew people who had invited the snakes in because they had started to grumble and nothing was ever right. And it manifests itself in physical ailments. And I said this at a church, and a lady came down. It was my next door neighbour, actually. She came down on a walking stick, and I said, how are you, Mrs.? And she hit the walking stick. She said, I'm bitter, aren't I? She actually hit me with the walking stick. And she said, you said I'm bitter. And I did think, well, shall I say, well, that appears to be the way. I didn't. And I'm not saying that everybody who has arthritis is bitter. But I'm saying you need to be careful what you invite in when you start to complain against God. And sometimes against people who are really, really honouring God's call and trying to exercise a ministry that God's given. I'm not saying me tonight, but as I say, I'm not saying everyone who's got arthritis is bitter. I'm just saying sometimes if you're bitter, you may get this manifestation. I've known loved ones who that's maybe the thorn in their flesh. But anyway, this lady gave me a good whack. I say that because when these people grumble, what they actually do is to invite God to withdraw his hand. And when he withdraws his hand, then they are prey to these venomous snakes. And there's nothing like a good snake bite to make you think maybe I've upset God. And what happens is they start to die. They've got their own. It's not a pandemic, but they've got their own epidemic going on there. Snakes are biting them and they're dying. Strangely, it didn't happen before, did it? They've come all across the desert and now it happens here and now. And the prayer they make is, Lord, or ask Moses to pray, Lord, take these snakes away. But God doesn't. He doesn't take the snakes away. What he does is to give them a remedy right in the middle of their troubles. Yeah, they're being bitten by snakes. God doesn't take the snake away. He gives a remedy, and the remedy is, Moses, make a bronze serpent, make a replica of the venomous snakes on the ground and put it on a pole. So when the children of Israel look at the snake on the pole, they will live. So Moses does it, and that is absolutely what happens. They look at the snake on the pole, they look and they live. And if you take it here, there's a lovely principle here. What is on the pole mirrors what's down on the ground, but it's the remedy to it. So when they look at the snake on the pole, it deals with the impact of the snake on the ground. Great. So how does that affect us? Well, in John's gospel, we all know John 3:16, but just before that, John 3:14 says, Jesus speaking to Nicodemus and says, if you don't understand earthly things, how are you ever going to understand heavenly things? And then he says to him, just as Moses lifted up the snake on the pole, so the Son of Man will be lifted up. And we know, yeah, that's exactly what happens. He is put on a cross. Just as Moses lifted up the snake on the pole, the Son of Man is lifted up on a pole, the cross. But if he's saying just as Moses did it, then the same principle that was there in the desert of Negev and beyond that, the same principle is at work with Jesus. What is lifted up is the remedy for what's on the ground. And what is on the cross mirrors what is on the ground. So what is on the ground that's biting us? What is the snake bite that's affecting us? Sin, sickness, sadness, all sorts of things. That is on the ground. Now that is taken up on the cross. He becomes my sin. He took my sin and my sorrow and made them his very own. He bore the burden to Calvary and suffered and died alone. So what is up on the cross mirrors what is down on the ground. He took my sin. He took my sickness. And he is inviting me now by that same principle to look up at the cross as the remedy for what is down on the ground. That's the natural extension. Just as Moses lifted this pole up, so Jesus is lifted up there, and he is now offering us deliverance, he's offering us salvation, offering us free from guilt. Whatever the snake bite is that's affecting me here, Jesus has taken that and he has overcome it. He is, as I say, the snake on the pole deals with the snake on the ground. Jesus taking my sin on the pole delivers me from the sin on the ground. Yeah, I'm still going to mess up. Yeah, I am still going to have to come to it. But I trace it back that very often the thing that's robbing us of all these things that Jesus wants is the actual attitude or spirit that we've got. Paul writes to the church in Thessalonica, the Thessalonian church, 1 Thessalonians chapter 5, at the end of the book, he's saying, rejoice always, pray continually, give thanks in every situation. I don't hear that he says you've got freedom to have a pop when you feel like it. When you think of Paul's situation to write that letter, rejoice always, in prison, being whipped, shipwrecked, all that list of gifts. Pray continually. Yeah, we'd sign up to that one. Give thanks in every situation. Every situation. A few of this. I want to see the man who died after 60 years of marriage. He was in a wheelchair because he went for surgery. He fell, broke his hip. They messed up the hip replacement, and now he won't walk again. He's in a wheelchair. His wife went into hospital for something, contracted COVID-19 and died. And I'm sat looking at him and I thought, I'll lighten the situation. And I said to him, have you always been lucky? And he looked at me and I thought at first I was going to say, I'd offended him, but he just fixed me with a gaze and he said, yes, I have. Yes, I was married to this wonderful woman for 60 years. When we had a funeral, there was a gazebo, there was a burial, just straight to the grave, a gazebo with him and 5 relatives. That's all we could have. And he's in a wheelchair. And when he came to throw the soil into the grave, he couldn't quite reach, and it just stuck on the edge. And I looked at him and I thought, gosh, does anything go right? But when I looked at this man, he just looked and he said, thank you. He said, thank you to that coffin. He was saying thank you to a woman who had given him 60 years of marriage. Thank you. And just blew her a kiss. And I thought, goodness, it put me to shame. It puts me to shame that he was saying, in the midst of all this grief and suffering, he's saying he's giving thanks for what he had, not what he lost. And if we get to that stage of saying, look, we've been doing a Bible study today with our church, end of John 16 into John 17, where he says, that Jesus knew where he'd come from was heaven. It had glory then. He was going back to it. Earlier, John writes, knowing where he'd come from, knowing where he's going, Jesus washed the disciples' feet. No grumble, because he knows where he once was and was going. And if we look and say, I know where I once was, I was lost. I know where I'm going now. I don't think anything else enters the equation, does it? Why would we be grumbling at God and his servant? But our old friendly serpent, it does pop up once, you probably know, in the second book of Kings, where it's Hezekiah has just ascended to the throne, and it says he removed the high places. He did as his father David had done, removed the high places, smashed the sacred stones, cut down the Asherah poles, broke into pieces the bronze serpent Moses had made. For up to that point, the Israelites had been burning incense to it. It was called Nehushtan. And I'm saying, Hezekiah had to break the pole because they'd started worshipping the bronze pole. They'd forgotten that was God's remedy for that time, was the bronze serpent. But they stopped worshipping God who'd given it, and they started worshipping the snake, almost like blind superstition. I don't know, forget that God has given us these wonderful things. We can start to worship, I don't know, a church, a building, a preacher, a worship band, forgetting the source of the deliverance is Christ by his Spirit. As he is lifted up, as Moses lifted up the serpent, it's not the serpent. And it's not the cross, is it? It's what happened on the cross and who was on the cross. And sometimes just to wave the cross, it can only ever be a reminder of who went there and what he did for us. The old Hammer House of horror films, they'd lift the cross up and it didn't matter what sort of person they was, the bad guy, the demon, whatever would go. No, it's who took our place on the cross. And again, he took my sin and my sorrow, he made them his very own. He bore the burden to Calvary, suffered and died alone for me, so that he'd be the remedy to my sin, so he'd be the remedy for my sickness, and so he would tell me again that he is taking me all the way home in him. So there you go. That's my thought on snakes. That's my thought on whatever's on that pole. It deals with whatever's on the ground beside me. Amen.
Amen. Thanks, Jeff. I've never liked